Hello, I'd like to welcome you to another session of the Greatest Books. Tonight we will continue looking at topic 3 in our sub-study of the greatest ideas in political philosophy, in the greatest books in political philosophy, the idea and the topic of ethics. Last time we began looking at the topic of ethics, we studied the end of human life, which we saw the philosophers in the ancient world, such as Aristotle, told us to be happiness. A happiness that's based upon the activation of all our human powers and potentialities, the power to know and to freely choose to move toward that end, which is happiness, and hopefully to possess all that the mind knows to be good and true and beautiful. This pursuit of happiness, Aristotle says, culminates in the highest human good, which he called the summum bonum, that of wisdom and contemplation, a contemplation of wisdom that takes us beyond the veil of darkness of this world into union with the good and the true and the beautiful. The human that attains this end as a permanent state of their character is said to be truly happy. This state of character, of wisdom and of fortitude, of strength, of moral virtue and intellectual virtue can never be taken from such a person, and consequently that person is said to be happy because he or she is beyond the confines and the fluctuations, the changes of the material finite world, in a state of soul that's peaceful in the gaze of good and true and beautiful with the possession of wisdom, which is a state of the person's character. We began by identifying the end of the study of ethics, or the end of the pursuit of human life, as happiness, because that is the proper place to begin. We can't talk about how to get to the end unless we know what the end is first. The end or purpose to which human nature moves. The end, Aristotle tells us, is the first consideration because it orders the means. Without knowing where we're going, Aristotle argued, we won't be able to know how to get there. We won't know how to guide our steps in the intended direction. Thus, after first properly identified the end, we are now able to be in a position to plan a life that pursues this end of happiness. We said this human happiness involves the use of the specifically human powers of the rational mind and the free will. Thus, ethics, after having identified the end, moves to a consideration of the human means by which this human end is pursued and hopefully attained. This pursuit of happiness doesn't just happen by itself. It requires the proper development of all of our human powers that help us to pursue it. These powers are twofold, indicating the powers of the mind, which we call intellectual, and the moral power to act of the will. These virtues, unlike instincts, are not something that's just part of human nature. These virtues take time to acquire and to develop. Consequently, the ethicist or the political philosopher or the moral philosopher reminds us that the human being is the only animal on the face of the earth that can say no to his or her own development. That is, since the pursuit of happiness must be first discovered with the mind and then freely chosen and then by an act of the free will pursued, I, you, any human being can say yes or can say no to human development. It's a crucial question. Human life is a serious matter. We can either grow or we can regress, but none of us can stand still. Knowing the end, we had the choice before us. Are we going to pursue it, or are we going to live a life that's destructive to our humanity? Human beings, being the only creatures that can say no to their own development, are involved in a serious pursuit of happiness. Consequently, life is not trivial. We are all on a difficult journey which is impossible to pursue and to accomplish without the proper equipment. We can't get there if we don't have the proper equipment for the journey. This equipment cannot be purchased with any amount of money. It must be acquired by our own efforts. It requires intellectual strength, discipline, courage, and the cooperation of others, all things that are necessary for us to attain our end. These prerequisites are powers that the philosophers have called virtue, and they divide these powers or virtues, which are means to the end of happiness, into two types, that which they call intellectual virtue and that which they call moral virtue. Intellectual virtue, they tell us, is made up of 5 parts. And if you think about it, you'll see these are the only 5 parts that the intellectual powers are about. Those are what they call art, practical wisdom, science, intuitive reason, and philosophical wisdom. These 5, art, prudence, science, intuition, and wisdom, they further divide into 2 categories, that which is called practical intellect, that which is called speculative intellect. I'd like to look at the practical intellectual virtues first. The first practical intellectual virtue is what's called art. And art is the capacity to make something that involves human reasoning. The origin of all things is in the maker, not in the things. When an artist creates a statue or a painting or a sculpture, it's not in the thing that the idea takes place. The idea takes place first in the mind of the artist, and then through his skill and his productive ability and the talent of his or her hands, the thing is made. Art is the making of things involving human reasoning. Lack of art is making without following the correct course of reason. If I just slop something on a canvas without even thinking about it, Aristotle would say that's not art, because art necessarily involves the correct use of reason being expressed through the skill of the artist into the creation of something that expresses the reason of the artist. Art is in the mind before it's in the hands. The other practical intellectual virtue is called practical wisdom or prudence. Prudence is correct knowledge about ends and means to achieve those ends. Practical things, we are told, are determined by the end, which is achieved not by knowing the first principles, as in speculative reason, but by grasping the end and moving toward it. That is, in speculative philosophy or wisdom, or using demonstrative science, we argue from principles through the syllogism to arrive at ends. We argue first forward from principles. In practical affairs, with practical thinking involving prudence, we must know the end first, and the end determines the means, because the end is what sets the parameters by which we will move, by which all action is determined. The end regulates practical action. We start with the end, not with the first principles, as we do in science or speculative wisdom. Practical wisdom is about variable things in the finite world of practical affairs, affairs that are always changing, and consequently it's never certain knowledge, because the playing field is always different. Politics in Russia and China are different than what they are in the United States. Because we're involved in practical affairs, the finite material world, and we're moving toward a particular end, the means are always different, because the circumstances are always different. So prudence is about knowledge about ends and means, knowing what the end is and being able to reason properly to employ the correct means to get us there. And the origin of all this practical action, we say, is choice. All practical action is based upon a choice, the choice that involves my reasoning and my will. I must desire to act correctly, and I must know how to act correctly. If I know how to act correctly and desire to know how to act correctly and know the end that I'm moving toward, I can make practical choices to get me there. For the speculative intellect, on the other hand, good and bad do not involve choice, but merely correct thinking. When I'm trying to prove, for example, the existence of God, as we did in an earlier intellectual exercise when we were talking about the syllogism and deduction, that was an intellectual exercise where the first thing was to have certain principles that we reason from to a conclusion. That's not the case in practical affairs. We don't go from principles, we go from the end first, and the end determines our action. Other than prudence, there's other types of intellectual virtues. One we call science. Scientific knowledge is simply about conclusions from demonstrations. All scientific knowledge proceeds from first principles. All practical knowledge proceeds from knowledge of the ends, as we just said. Fourth, we have what's known as intuitive reason. Intuitive reason is the power which grasps the truths of the first principles without the aid of demonstration. That is, somehow the human mind can grasp the truth, the self-evident truth that something cannot come from nothing. I can grasp that truth without a demonstrative demonstration or a syllogism or a demonstration, because I understand it once I know the terms. We say it's intuitive. I understand it because it's self-evident. There is no need for demonstration. And the ability to understand the self-evidence of some particular principle is called to be intuitive reason. Finally, the philosophers divide the intellectual virtues into the fifth category, wisdom, the understanding of the highest things. The understanding of the highest things. This is speculative knowledge which deals with invariable truths, truths that do not change, but truths that are constant, truths that are beyond sense, such as God. Art and prudence, being practical, deal with variables in the material world that is always changing. Thus we say decisions of the practical intellect do not have the truth validity, and the conclusions of the speculative intellect is more certain than the conclusion of the practical intellect, because the practical intellect is always dealing with change, making judgments about things that are always different, depending on the end hoped for, but operating and moving toward the end in environments that are always different and requiring different means. The speculative intellect, therefore, we say is scientific. The practical intellect is calculative. It calculates, given such and such a scenario. It calculates how to achieve the end. Different scenarios and contingencies make it, different scenarios, different contingencies force different means, different avenues, different ways to achieve the end. Thus, in conclusion, with the intellectual virtues, I quickly went over them, but those are all five. In conclusion, we say these five are subdivided into speculative and into practical. 3 of them are speculative. Intuition, science, and wisdom are all speculative. And 2 are practical, that deal with the practical world. Art is the ability to make according to true reasoning, and prudence is right reasoning with respect to action and means, both having to deal with the practical world. Now, a person with such an intellect, with all 5 of those virtues activated, such an intellect, Cardinal Newman tells us in his book, The Idea of the University, such an intellect, Newman says, is so excellent a portion of us, it is not only beautiful, admirable, and noble in itself, but in a true and high sense, it must be useful to the possessor and all around as diffusing good, or as a blessing, or a gift, or a power, or a treasure, first to its owner, then through him to the world. The possession of all these intellectual virtues, including prudence and wisdom, science and intuition, and correct thinking, is a treasure first to the owner and then to all around him or her in the world. It's a treasure to me because it helps me to know my end and how to live my life properly to attain that great end. It's a treasure to you because if my mind and my life is being lived properly and acting correctly, I can help you to achieve your end. And hopefully we can help each other. That's what life in community is about, helping each other to pursue happiness. These intellectual virtues have something in common. They all result from discipline, habituation, and the constant training. In short, they are acquired virtues which take much time and effort to achieve. As we saw when we examined the difference in the liberal arts between the trivium and the quadrivium, when we talked about the higher liberal arts and sciences being achieved. These intellectual virtues must be achieved after much hard effort. The intellectual virtues that must be achieved are complemented by other virtues known as moral virtues, which also must be achieved. But the intellectual virtues are about thinking. The moral virtues which complement them, on the other hand, are about action. And I'd like to look at those moral virtues with you for a moment here, for the next 5 or 10 minutes. The first thing we want to say about moral virtue is it has to do with action. Moral virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, and choice is a deliberate desire. It's a state of my soul, it's a state of my character, it's part of me. It's not something I do once in a while, it's something I do continually because it becomes habitual. It's part of my character. So it's a habitual state of my character which involves me in choice all the time. Choice which involves my mind, and reasoning that must be true, desire that must be right, if the choice is to be good. If I make choices all the time, to make the correct choices, my reason must be strong, and my will must desire the good or the right. If my mind knows the good and my will desires the good, I can make choices toward the good. So we say moral choice has to do with action that involves deliberation, with both the mind and the will being formed to know the good and to do the good. Now this moral virtue has 4 parts. And the 4 parts of moral virtue are prudence and temperance and fortitude and justice. I'd like to look at prudence first because we've placed prudence already as an intellectual virtue. So it's interesting to find here that's also a moral virtue. Prudence, as we said, is knowing the correct ends and the correct means to achieve them. It's an intellectual virtue that regulates and is antecedent to all of our action. It regulates action and is antecedent or prior to our action. But because it deals with action, it's classified as a moral virtue as well as an intellectual virtue. As I told you, moral virtue has to do with action. Now Thomas Aquinas, in speaking of the moral virtues of prudence and its unique categorization as both a moral virtue and an intellectual virtue, said this: accordingly, we must say that since prudence is in the reason, it is differentiated from other intellectual virtues by a material difference of objects. Wisdom, knowledge, and understanding are about necessary things, whereas art and prudence are about contingent things, as we just said. Art being concerned with things made, that is, with things produced in external manner, such as a house, a knife, and so forth, and prudence being concerned with things done, that is, with things that have their being in the doer himself. On the other hand, prudence is differentiated from the moral virtues according to a formal aspect distinctive of powers, that is, the intellective power, wherein is prudence, and the appetitive power, wherein is moral virtue. The intellectual power, the powers of the mind; the appetitive, my emotions, those things that move me toward action. And we find that prudence is differentiated from the moral virtues because it's also an intellective power, not just an appetitive power. Where prudence, wherein is moral virtue, and the appetitive powers. Hence, it is evident Aquinas concludes that prudence is a special virtue, distinct from all the other virtues. Now, in addition to prudence, which deals with correct thinking and with action, and therefore is in a special category of its own, we have the other moral virtues of temperance and fortitude. Temperance and fortitude are also habits of doing. Temperance can simply be called self-discipline, that discipline, that self-control by which I regulate my passions. Fortitude can simply be called courage, the courage to do what my mind apprehends to be the right thing to do. The truth that my mind knows is not enough if I don't have the courage to do it. So temperance is the regulation of my passions and my appetites. Fortitude is the courage to do that which my mind apprehends as right. These virtues are formed by doing them. Virtues are first formed by good habits, the habit of correct actions, formed by doing them. And these correct actions, these habits, moderate the passions and the appetite. And all these moral virtues of temperance and fortitude have what's called a mean, or a mid place, a place that is the correct amount of action, and it relates to excess and defect. There's this middle place. I can either do too much or too little of something. The correct moral action is in the mean, in the middle. So these virtues of temperance and fortitude that pertain to myself and the regulation of my passions, my emotions, and my appetites have a mean, which the philosophers tell us is the correct place for them to be. If I have too much or too little of a particular virtue, it is not virtuous anymore. Consequently, it is of these virtues that we speak when we speak of moderation. The Latin phrase virtue or virtu est medius stat. Virtue est medius stat. Virtue is in the middle of the road. When we talk about moderation and temperance and virtue being in the middle, we're talking about those particular moral virtues of temperance and fortitude which regulate the passions. Aristotle means, when he talks about the virtue being in the middle of the road, that it moderates all the passions and appetites that move man toward his end. He doesn't mean we can have moderation of all the pleasures and pursuits, but only those that contribute to growth and the end of happiness. In other words, I'm supposed to eat in moderation, I'm supposed to sleep in moderation, I'm supposed to drink in moderation, and all things in moderation, virtus and medius stat. What he means by all things is all things that are conducive to human development, all things that move us toward our end, all things that are good because they move us toward the end of the pursuit of happiness, which doesn't mean all things in general, but all things that move us toward our end are good in moderation, that involve the pleasures and the passions. All things that are grasped by the mind as good and true and beautiful. As an example of virtue being in medias stat, take a look at courage. Courage is that virtue that allows us to act correctly in the face of danger. If I have too much courage, I'm said to exceed the mean and do things rashly. I do things overconfidently. I might do things foolishly. And if I have too much courage, I can get myself and everyone else in trouble. Sometimes courage involves walking away rather than flying into the face of danger. The one who flies into the face of danger without considering the consequences is said not to be courageous but rash. On the other hand, to have too little courage, to be afraid, is to be called a coward. I don't want to have too little courage. I don't have too much courage. I don't want to be rash. I don't want to be a coward. I want to be courageous. That means having virtue in the middle of the road. Another example that's easy to see is in the area of temperance. If I eat too much, I'm called a glutton. If I eat too little, I'll be too thin. The right place to be is in the middle, having not too much or not too little. And since the moral virtues of temperance and fortitude are concerned with moderating the passions and actions of excess and defect, they are both forms of failure. That is, let me say it again, since temperance and fortitude are concerned with moderating the passions and the actions, excess and defect are both forms of failure. If I have too much or too little, they're both forms of failure. And consequently, I won't be virtuous, but I'll be something else, invirtuous or unvirtuous, not acting correctly as I should to achieve my end. Now, these emotions and these passions and appetites that the moral virtues deal with are all good, but they all need to be ordered and directed to the correct end by the intellect. There's nothing wrong with anger or with hatred or with the other or pleasure. All these emotions that we have, they're part of our human nature, and this nature we believe to be good. It's not the emotions, it's the use of the emotions, the inordinate use or attachment to the emotions. So, for example, pleasure is a very wonderful emotion that must be used for the proper end. The problem is that the end of pleasure is mistaken for the means. That pleasure does not, the problem is, the danger is that pleasure becomes the end rather than a means to the highest ends, to the highest things. If we delight in the pleasure inordinately, we'll lose both the sight of the end and the virtue necessary to attain it. If we delight in this pleasure inordinately, if we take extra delight in the senses, we'll lose sight both of the end and of the virtue necessary to attain that end. If we will lose sight because the pleasure will become the end. We'll live for the pleasure, and therefore we'll lose sight of the true end, the higher goal of happiness. And not only will we lose sight of the higher end, but we'll lose the virtue, because the virtue is lost in the excess or the defect, such as the strength of the body is lost by gluttony or by starvation, or the strength of the body is lost by too much sleep or not enough sleep. I can sap my strength, my physical strength, by too much or too little of things, so I lose the virtue necessary to attain the end and the vision of that end itself. Boredom becomes habitual, as does gluttony, and when habitually desired and pursued, these ends sap the life and the vision of and the strength to achieve the true and higher ends of human happiness, as the intellectual good of wisdom and union with the good, the true, and the beautiful. If I sap my nature because I live a life of gluttony and pleasure, I'll never have the ability to get my ends. And not only will I lose the ability to achieve those ends, I'll lose the ability to see those ends because I become habitually tied to a life of pleasure. The pursuit here of the higher things requires wisdom, and wisdom doesn't wait for any man. She hides herself, and she reveals herself only to those who come after her persistently, those who search for her willingly and diligently. And when this wisdom is possessed, she shares her goodness and her beauty in abundance. Along the way to this possession of wisdom are many counterfeits, snares, and traps, many dangers for the underprepared, for the undisciplined, the weak, and the foolhardy. This is a serious journey, this goal towards happiness, and it requires wisdom. Wisdom itself must be acquired for the journey. Wisdom itself is necessary. Wisdom is what's most necessary in the pursuit of happiness, and we can't have this wisdom unless we go after this wisdom and giving up everything else, so to speak, to go after it. The emotions and the appetites are good, but they need to be ordered and directed to the correct end by the intellect. We can have too much or too little in those things, in those passions. We can have too much or too little fear and confidence, anger, pleasure, and pain. They maybe feel too much or they maybe feel too little. But to feel them right, at the right time, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way is the intermediate which is characteristic of virtue. Again, let me say that. To have the emotions at the right time, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way is the mean we're looking for. That is characteristic of virtue. All emotions are for the good. They're to move us toward our end. Our job is to understand each of those emotions, to regulate them, and to use them in pursuit of happiness, guided by the intellect. For example, even hatred is a powerful emotion that can be good if it has its object those things that should be hated. If I hate those things, such as if I'm a Christian or a Jew, and I hate the devil, I hate evil, I'm supposed to hate it. I'm not supposed to love it. It's something opposed to my advancement. It's something opposed to the good of human beings. And if I hate it with the right amount, at the right time, to the right extent, then that's said to be virtuous. But if I hate things I'm not supposed to hate, people I'm not supposed to hate, if I hate the wrong things with the wrong amount, at the wrong time, in the wrong situations, that's not called to be a good emotion. Then the emotion is being used wrongly. Another great emotion would be anger. Anger is an emotion that's given to move us to hate, to be against all that would ruin us, that would destroy us, that is unjust. Righteous anger against all that is unjust. For example, Jesus turning over the table for money lenders in the temple. He was acting justly. His anger was at the right moment, toward the right people, in the right amount. We say his emotions were under the control of his intellect. He wasn't acting against the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong amount. He was using anger correctly. The final moral virtue that we have to look at tonight is justice. Justice involves keeping balance in human and social relationships. It's the only virtue that's related to our neighbor. It has to deal with keeping things in proportion, keeping them balanced. Aristotle says, this then is what the just is, the proportional. The unjust is what violates the proportional. Hence, one term becomes too great, the other too small, as indeed happens in practice. For the man who acts unjustly has too much, and the man who is unjustly treated too little of what is good. So justice has to do with a balance, a proportion in our relationships to others, keeping our relationships fair and equitable, given our circumstances. Justice is a special part of moral virtue, as we said, that which has to do with relationships in the community. It's that part of moral virtue par excellence that is the concern of politics, which governs human relationships in community, as we will see when we examine politics. So justice is, for us, an extra important virtue, because it's that virtue that regulates human relationships in community, which is what politics is about. And these human relationships in community are of three types. We have relationships of individuals to individuals, of individuals to society, and of society to the individuals. And each one of those relationships have a different part of justice, or a different type of justice that regulates those relationships. Now, for example, in the relationship of individuals to individuals, we have what's called commutative justice. And commutative justice is dealt with by the civil law. It's the civil law that regulates the action between individuals and keeps those actions and those relationships in balance, the balance they had before the relationship started and the balance that should be in place during those relationships and at the conclusion of those relationships. And it's exemplified in the term lex talionis, the law of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Lex talionis has to do with commutative justice, the justice that regulates relationships between individuals. This type of lex talionis, this type of commutative justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, isn't something that just was true in the Old Testament. It continues to be true in the 21st century. Because this commutative justice put a limit on revenge, and it puts a limit on retribution, so that everything is kept in balance. If you came to my house and you were injured at my home, it would be my responsibility to do something about it. If I were a good man and a just man, I would not have to be compelled by the laws to help you out. I would be compelled by my reason and by my own inner goodness to correct the situation. We now have an imbalance, a whack. Our relationship is out of whack. It was not out of whack before you came here and got hurt. It's out of whack as a consequence of our relationship. And being a just man, I have responsibility to correct that and put it back into balance. If I don't do that, then the laws can force me to do that. A civil suit in the court of law results in me making restoration and putting the relationship back into balance. If I don't do it voluntarily, the state, through the power of commutative justice, will force me to put the relationship back into balance. Nor should you, as a just person, ask for more than your injury. If you received $1,000 worth of doctor bills and medical treatment and missed another $1,000 worth of work, I should be, in justice, give you what you lost to put the relationship back into balance, the $2,000. If you sue me for $1 million, then you're unjust, not me. Justice simply involves the balance, the proportionate relationship that's kept that way, and this commutative justice regulates our relationships with one another. The other type of justice we call distributive justice. And distributive justice has to deal with giving equals equally and unequals unequally. It has to deal with the general distribution of the scarce resources in society. And those people who deserve more should get more, those people who deserve less should get less. And those who do the same should get the same, those who do less should get less, those who do more should get more. It's distribution, the distribution of the rewards of society. For example, I'm a PhD professor of politics. If you pay me $70,000 a year to teach politics, and then you bring in a person with an associate's degree and pay them $70,000 a year to teach politics, we say we have a problem of violation of distributive justice, because unequals are receiving unequally. Intellectually, academically, we're unequal. One's a PhD, one's an associate. The pay should be commensurate with the ability and with the skill. And we call that type of justice that gives to equals equally and unequals unequally distributive justice. The final type of justice we call social justice. Social justice has to deal with the relationship of the individuals to the society. Distributive justice is the society to the individual, commutative justice is the individual to the individual, and social justice is the relationship of the individual to society. Because being a social being, I need this society in order to pursue happiness. I need to live in the community and partake of the benefits of this community. But if I were just a taker, I would be an unjust person. And if we were all just takers, social life would cease, and human happiness would not be possible. Since our pursuit of happiness requires us to live in communities, and all of us have to pursue this happiness in community, it requires us each to give to the community those abilities and talents which we have for the benefit of ourselves and for each other. I depend upon you, you depend upon me. Ask not what America can do for you. Ask not what your country can do for you, John F. Kennedy said. Ask what you can do for your country. That's an explicit statement of social justice. The next question becomes, which one is more important? When we have an answer to that question, when we look at next time we'll get an answer to that question, and we have an important to the question, which virtue is more important, intellectual or moral, then we'll have to ask, what do we do with people who have only moral virtue or intellectual virtue, who have only one and not the other, or who don't have either one? And when we look at that question, it leads us straight to the topic of politics, which concerns the regulating of social life, in which very real human beings, developed and underdeveloped, advanced and underadvanced, educated and undereducated, must live together in close proximity for the achievement of their ends. This question of which virtue is more important and what we do with people who have only a few or none of the virtues is a very relevant topic to politics, and we're about ready to make that jump to politics after we answer these questions in our final look at ethics in our next session. We hope you benefited by this presentation tonight. We look forward to seeing you next time as we continue to explore the greatest ideas and the greatest books in political philosophy. Good night, and God bless you.